Episode 61. In 1961, John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. The recession that started in 1960 ended 10 months later in 1961 after a period of monetary tightening, and 61% of Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio is tied up in just 3 stocks. Beyond MD, Episode 61, here we go! Hey everyone, welcome back to the Beyond MD podcast. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day again to join me. So if there's one thing I've learned over time, it's that most successful people tend to have multiple streams of income. And that will be the focus for the next 2 episodes. In these episodes, I get to sit down with Dr. Stephanie Zhou, and she takes time to talk about her various streams of income. And it's quite an impressive list. We go over about 10 different streams, and it's an open-ended discussion, lots to cover, therefore over 2 episodes. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Steph practices addictions medicine at Sunnybrook Hospital and is a lecturer for the financial literacy curriculum at the University of Toronto Temerity Faculty of Medicine. In addition to financial education, she also does research in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and co-developed the diversity mentorship program at U of T. Steph is a strong advocate for equalizing student knowledge when it comes to personal finance and often combines her 2 interests in financial education and diversity and inclusion in her lectures. Amazingly, the Women Executive Network in 2022 placed Dr. Steph in their list of the top 100 most powerful women in Canada. In 2022, Steph and her husband Colin Lynch also made a generous gift to establish the Equity Award, which is a new fund that will support and empower medical students with demonstrated financial need. Steph also hosts the Physician Financial Wellness Conference annually. The last one was this November. Hopefully you've been enjoying snippets from the conference on YouTube. And I'm sure many of you know this, but in case you don't, she has wonderful educational resources on YouTube and Instagram. The handles are Breaking Bad Debt, a phenomenal educational resource on finance for everyone. So with that, guys, here is part 1 of my interview with Dr. Steph Zhou on various streams of income. Steph, welcome back to the podcast. So this is our second time on the pod together. I'm really happy to have you back. I always enjoy talking to you and learning from you. And I think you have so much on the go that's going to be relevant to today. So today we're going to be talking about various streams of income. And I can tell you, Steph, that when I started medicine, this was a very foreign concept to me. And still, it's very, very early days for me. But I know that you're up to so much, and I think you have a lot to share here. And also, one thing I've learned over time is that a lot of the successful people that I run into who are, in a way, able to live the way they want to live life, most of them tend to have more than a single stream of income. So I think it's healthy for us to all think in this way. So, Steph, why don't you just talk to us about some of your streams of income, and then we can pick away at them in a bit more detail.
For sure. So I guess maybe before we get to talking about the different streams of income, I do want to recognize that I'm in a very privileged position and how grateful I am to be in a career that allows for the flexibility to pursue multiple interests. And for myself, I grew up with parents who worked in the gig economy. So for a lot of them, and for many Canadians, working multiple jobs, it's not really because they wanted to pursue different interests, but it's more rather out of necessity to keep up with rising costs of living. And I also want to say that multiple income streams is not usually the norm in medicine, as clinical income is pretty stable, it's pretty well paying. But growing up with parents who worked like multiple jobs, that's what was familiar to me, and that felt like the norm for me. So I also had multiple jobs from undergrad to residency and now even as staff. So I know that we might touch on this a little bit throughout the episode, but that's kind of how I've chose to craft my career in this way.
I just want to add one thing. Yeah. Steph, I love how you are so in touch with how you were brought up. Like, just life with your parents back in the day. And you brought this up on our last conversation too. And I have to say, I have a lot of respect for that. You're very in tune with things, and that's kind of shaping your journey today. But I'm going to let you carry on. But I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just list them all. Yeah. And then maybe we can do a bit of a deeper dive into some of them or all of them if we have time.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one that's, I guess, most obvious is clinical income. And this is where it's patient facing. Second one is administrative income. So anything that you do, QI, stuff for the hospital, things like that, leadership grants. Number 3, research grants for all sorts of research or education that I do. Number 4, education stipends. So anything related to teaching, speaking engagements, teaching awards, etc.
Hmm.
Number 5, board membership. Number 6, startup advising. Number 7, real estate in the traditional sense. Number 8, investing in equities in the traditional sense. Number 9, I don't really consider this a source of income, but I'll just throw it in there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Social media. So, for example, YouTube, Instagram. And in your case, like podcasting, we can maybe touch on that as
Yeah,
well.
sure.
And number 10, again, I'll explain this maybe later, but I don't exactly consider this a stream of income, but investing in venture capital funds.
Hmm.
And number 11, again, not really a stream of income, the Physicians Financial Wellness Conference.
Hmm.
That one is entirely philanthropic stream of income. So those are the ones that I've just listed out.
Okay. And thank you for that. That's such a thorough list. And I think if people just take a look at that list, while we may see ourselves as physicians day to day, single dominant stream of income, I think a lot of people can go down that list and say, okay, you know what? I'm investing. I maybe get a few dividends from time to time, or, if you have a real estate investment, you're probably already knocking off a few additional streams of income. So that's something to just acknowledge and give yourself a pat on the back. So, okay, first one is your practice. And I think this is really interesting, Steph, even though it's your day to day, and this is what most people know you for. But you're a family physician and you specialize in addictions. But tell us a bit about just how your practice is structured and the various streams of income within. I think this is really interesting because I hear a lot about family doctors. My sister's a family doctor. It can be a very demanding job. There's a lot of paperwork involved, but at the same time, as you have painted the picture, it can be flexible too, and you can carve out your interests. So talk to us about the structure of your practice and some of the streams of income within that.
For sure. So it kind of reminds me of the conversation that we had on my YouTube video. I think it's the one where we talk about like our financial wins.
Mm-hmm.
And I had made a comment about how family medicine is considered a permissive specialty,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
whereas there are other specialties that might be more restrictive specialties. And when I call family medicine a very permissive specialty, I was referring to the flexibility of family medicine in that there's so many ways that you can take a career into so many different avenues as a family doctor. So in my first year after residency, I actually did something very different from a lot of my colleagues who either locumed in just one clinic or took over a practice. So I had 4 jobs and 4 separate sources of income. So I was doing addictions medicine, which is fee for service, about 3 half days a week. Family medicine, like your family health group FIGs, 2 full days a week. And then telemedicine to rural areas. That was about 1.5 days a week. And then there were just these random COVID vaccinations, call centers to notify people of COVID positivity. Because I spoke a different language, like that was really helpful. So I had those kind of scattered in between.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were other things like teaching and things like that, but we'll touch on that later.
Yeah.
So while that variety sounds very busy, I actually like that I diversified my practice in the beginning that way, because the way that I think about it is it's like similar to the stock market. Like when the pandemic hit, doctors running in-person practices that were largely fee-for-service or FIG practices, they didn't end up having the patient volumes or the telemedicine infrastructure to be profitable. Fortunately, I also happened to be working in a telemedicine clinic at the time that also had a lot of the systems in place already. So my clinical income didn't get affected that much. And like other careers, medicine is also very subject to changes in government policy. And one of those being the billing codes, which change very often. So when virtual care billing codes were significantly cut for family doctors, I was then able to ramp down the telemedicine practice, ramp up the in-person family medicine clinic without much impact to billings. So I mentioned that, there was also administrative teaching and research income. So those kind of things also allow me the flexibility to dial up and down different parts of my work. So for example, if I'm absolutely burned out by one area or external forces make working in that environment untenable, I can just let it go without significant financial impact.
Mhm.
And I guess the other benefit of doing what I did was that it also gave me a lot of negotiating power. People are protective of my time, knowing that I have other commitments going on,
Mhm.
which may allow me to decline various requests for joining committees if I don't feel I can contribute in a meaningful manner. And also just being able to say, like, no deal because I have other options available is one of the most powerful cards when it comes to negotiating as well.
That is really well thought out, Steph. I have two quick follow-up questions. So the way that your practice is structured, do you have enough flexibility to be like, hey, you know what? I've done my clinical work, my admin work, and now I maybe have like a Friday or Monday to dedicate to my creative tasks, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But does your practice allow for that?
Yeah, for sure. So right now I have Fridays and Mondays off from clinical duties.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean I'm not working on those days. Those days can be considered my admin or research days. Like I actually have funding to do a certain amount of admin work or research work. And so I guess the nice thing about it is with clinical work, sometimes you have to be physically there. Like you can't be in, I don't know, like let's say like this weekend, I'm going to Montreal for a conference.
Yeah.
So I can't be like in Montreal on a Friday while also seeing my patients, many of them who want to see me in person, for example.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I can work on research papers or work on a grant from literally anywhere. So I've structured it that way because I feel like having a 4-day weekend allows me to spend time with family and also with admin work. You can kind of do it anytime as long as it gets done.
Yeah.
It's not like restricted to like 9 to 5 or whatever hours clinical hours might be.
Yeah, super interesting. Now, I think a lot of us have fallen into the trap of maybe picking up too much clinical work at some point in our career. I know I have, and I know I still struggle with this, but I find that some of the additional things that I do, so like let's say if I've gone through a stretch where I feel like I'm doing a lot of radiology, my mind wants to shift to something different, something more creative. So then it may be, reading something on my list of books or preparing for a podcast or interviewing you like I am today. I find that variety it actually keeps me going despite doing multiple things. So I guess for you, my question is, doing so many things, it often feels like people can be pulled in so many different directions. But do you find that variety actually gives you more kind of sustenance for your practice too? I'm just curious what your take is on this.
Yeah, for sure. And I know we definitely touched on this a little bit in our interview on YouTube as well, where you mentioned that it's nice to kind of have that switch, and that variety allows you to have different knowledge in many different areas where like being a podcaster would be very different part of your brain, that using very different part of your brain than being a radiologist, for example. And so the one thing I want to highlight with that question is it kind of reminds me of the concept of deep work that's talked about in Cal Newport's books, as well as in Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, yeah.
And both of these books, they highlight the importance of doing undistracted focus work. So for example, thinking fast, it's reactive, right? Thinking slow is methodical.
Mhm.
And so when I'm doing research for like a new lecture, editing a YouTube video, or reading over a student's abstract submission, I'm in a quiet environment and I'm able to achieve flow state where I can be focused on what I'm doing for several hours. But let's say you contrast that, and I'm going to use family medicine clinic, for example, just because that's what I know.
Mhm.
You see a patient every 10 minutes. As the patients are listing out some of their concerns, sometimes in the middle of talking about one issue, it might remind them of another issue that they start talking about in the middle of the first issue. And so it diverts your attention. The nurse or the secretary might be calling you, knocking on your door, messages popping up on your EMR. There's very little opportunity there to do deep work.
Mhm.
So you're thinking fast. You're entering the reactive state where it might be more easy to make mistakes. You might be more quick to react in anger or frustration
Mhm.
if there's a tricky patient interaction, for example. And I feel like a lot of doctors would agree with me that being in a reactive state, having your sympathetic nervous system be on mode 5 days a week, that will definitely burn you out. And so that's why, like, knowing my own capacity, that's why I dialed up my addictions practice, where you get to spend maybe like 40 minutes, 50 minutes with a patient. And I've started to dial down a little bit my fee-for-service family practice because I felt, my way of working and maybe my mental health was better when I can spend a little bit more time with patients. And then it also, because family medicine is a permissive specialty, it also gave me the flexibility to convert our family practice, which was previously a FIG, into a FO, which is not so much paid based on volumes. So that way I have a little bit more time with patients. And so it's all about trying to achieve that flow state for me and not having to be very reactive in my day-to-day work.
I think there's so many useful pearls there, Steph. That's fantastic. Let's maybe move on to your additional sources of income. So having a role as an administrator and then also through research grants. I don't really want to lump these necessarily, but these are the next two I want to talk about. So your admin income, I know you have a big focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Talk to us a bit more about this. How much of your time does this take up? And then I'm just curious, of your entire income, what proportion is admin percentage wise? I'm just kind of curious and how that's evolved over time.
For sure. Yeah. So how academics are paid is through FTEs. So FTEs they stand for full-time equivalents. And so if you're working one FTE, you're basically working 5 days a week doing that particular admin or educational role. And so for my admin role, that one is 0.1 FTE, and it varies across different universities, but U of T 0.1 FTE is equivalent to about 20,000 a year. And so you can kind of stack them up. So for example, if you have this admin role in one area and you have a research role in another area, and that's also your department is also funding you for an 0.1 FTE here or there, you can kind of add them up. So that way, let's say you're working one FTE, that might come out to be about 200,000 a year. And those FTEs, the nice thing about it is very flexible. You can do it if you're on maternity leave. You can do it if it's on the weekend. You can work on it in the evenings too. It's not like the half day or 0.1 FTE has to be 9 to 12, for example.
Interesting.
So that's one way to kind of move it around. In terms of the percentage of my income, it's hard to say. The reason why is because research grants. So for example, I had a research grant this year that was about 15,000 for the year. That's another pool of income. But then depending on if your research wins awards, that can come with additional random smaller lumps of income as well. Certain grants that you can get throughout the year as well can also add on to your main lump sum of research income. And then also things like teaching awards or things like that can also add on too. So it kind of fluctuates every year depending on, I guess, how productive you are and how many additional grants you choose to apply for. So you mentioned that, yes, a lot of my research is in equity, diversity, inclusion. My leadership role is in EDI as well. And I also do research in financial education. But unfortunately, I think maybe in just like a medical system or maybe an academic system, that's not really well funded, or there isn't really any grants available that specifically fund financial education research for students in medicine. But there are a lot more that fund EDI research.
Okay, perfect. And Steph, two things I'll say. One, I hope that with your ongoing efforts and with other people in this space, I hope that research in finance does get funded one day. I think it's an important area. And so my youngest has made it into the room. I thought he wasn't going to make it in. But the other thing I will say is your comment about admin work, which I really, really like. So I've often fallen into the trap of, okay, you know what? My focus is clinical work. That's got to be it. And I don't have time to take on admin work. But the way you describe it, you can look at admin work as a great way of kind of introducing time and geographical freedom into your life, which I think are really important concepts. And these are things that I'm embracing more with time. So Steph, let's move on to, I guess we can make this source of income number 4. So you educate people. You educate people, I assume, in family medicine, but what you're best known for is educating others, I think, in financial literacy. I have students now who come to the hospital and universally, they all mention your name. They're like, you know what, Dr. Steph's doing a great job teaching us about this because otherwise we literally would have no exposure. So I think that's wonderful on your end. So talk to us about when you're giving lectures, when you're invited to speak. Sometimes we aren't actually offered any income. So two-part question. One is, how do you go about asking for compensation, in a way that's professional? Because we also have to realize that our time, like everyone else, our time is valuable. And then the other thing that I often struggle with is I will get pulled in to, or I'll be asked to maybe speak about financial literacy to whether it's physician groups. And so the one thing I struggle with here is while I'm developing knowledge, I'm still not an expert in this space. I'm still a learner, although I'm developing knowledge. So I do struggle with that sometimes in terms of asking for payment. But I just want to know how you navigate all this.
Yeah, so I do agree. They don't often come with compensation. And how I ask is I usually just ask directly, right? Because there's no harm in asking. So I just say like, oh, I just wanted to check if this speaking engagement does come with any sort of honorarium or funding, especially given that I have to cancel clinic time in order to do this engagement. So I might kind of put it in that sort of context. And for myself, usually, I know you said I am usually asked to teach about financial literacy, but I also teach a lot about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I get asked to do that as well. And in the first 2 years of me teaching in those two areas, I actually was not paid. But the way I think about it was I was building up my teaching dossier. So, which I guess that has now become my YouTube channel, Breaking Bad Debt. So the only reason I started that channel in the first place is because a lot of us in academia, we have to keep track of all of our teaching in a teaching dossier that we have to submit for promotions. And I guess I figured, okay, well, I'll keep track of it, but I can also record my lectures as well and just put them on YouTube so that people can actually see how I teach. And so that has since kind of grown. And that's also given me a little bit more credibility and the portfolio of teaching that I've done to be able to ask for compensation. And so it's kind of similar to if you were a part of a speakers bureau, they will also have a collection of different speeches you would have given in the past, so that if a company wants to ask you to speak for them, they will see your your lecturing style or your speaking style, for instance. Your second part of the question about, not seeing yourself as an expert. So I also agree. I'm not an expert either, but my goal is not to be an expert in finance, as it's hard for me to reach like the same level of expertise as someone like Ben Felix, for example, who does financial research as his main job. So this is why I've collaborated with experts in finance like Ben to deliver lectures that were recorded to YouTube. So my goal actually is to be an expert in teaching. So if I can explain a complex financial concept to a layperson better than a financial expert can, then I've accomplished my goal. And even on my YouTube channel, one of my best performing videos is simplifying maternity and parental leave. And I don't even have children. So yet that video has gotten like 20,000 views and hundreds of comments saying how, oh, this made such a complex system so clear for people. And so I think from a teaching perspective, I think I was successful as a teacher, even though I'm not exactly an expert in like maternity leave, for instance.
That is very well said. Very interesting too. So, Steph, I want to just take a moment now. We've talked about your practice. We've talked about your responsibilities with admin and research. And now we've talked about you being an educator and spending time on that. So with all that going on, I just want to know, like people ask me this too. I don't think I have a great answer, but like, how do you manage your time to accomplish all these things?
Yeah. So I guess the first part is right now I don't have kids. So maybe things might change when you do have a family, right? And I will have to think about how my systems are going to be put to the test when there are going to be kids in the picture, for instance. So I do want to acknowledge all the parents who are listening, because having children is another job in itself, and it's quite a lot of work as well. The second thing I was going to say is having teams and systems in place. So for instance, being in an academic setting, you can have access to residents, fellows, medical students who are all part of the team that you manage.
Hmm.
And they are ways for you to be more efficient in seeing patients. If you invest the time in the beginning to teach the, let's say, medical student about the systems in your clinic, how things are run, they're actually very good at helping facilitate those systems run very smoothly, whether they might be scribing for you in clinic, whether they might be helping you with filling out forms and things like that. The other thing is, even with running the Physicians Financial Wellness Conference, you're basically organizing this conference with a team of 10 students. And so there are students who are helping you with seeking out sponsorships and grants and things like that. So recently we got a grant from Doctors of BC, which wasn't easy because, like I mentioned before, there's not a lot of grant funding for financial literacy. Some of them are working on research as part of the conference. So some of them will be presenting their research at another conference.
Okay.
And so they're working on that. You're just reading over their abstract, making sure it's everything is correct, giving them some advice on doing like an REB, for example, things like that. And then you also have members of the team who are working on marketing. So there's many different working parts, right? And different people running these parts for you, and you're overseeing it all. So I think that's also another way of how I manage to take on a lot and do research and do teaching and things like that when you have a big team working for you and they all know their individual roles very well, for instance.
I think that's great. And I've heard about this concept of creating a system, probably more work up front, but then down the road, probably saving you lots of time. So time well spent. I think that's great. So let's continue to move on. You've also mentioned that board membership as being potentially a source of income. And this is interesting to me because when I started medical practice, this was such a foreign concept to me. But now as I'm meeting more people, whether it's through talking to people like you or just other episodes in the podcast, I hear about board memberships quite frequently. Talk to us about kind of what role this plays in your life, and talk to us about how income is generated when you're sitting on a board, whether it's direct income, whether it's equity, things like that.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I wanted to emphasize is kind of a pattern you'll see in a lot of these income sources is that they do take time to build up, just like how you won't see the gains of your investment until like years later. This is how I kind of see joining boards as well. Also kind of as part of my things to do when I'm retired strategy. So I've been a part of boards ever since I was a resident. And then when I became a staff physician, I joined a nonprofit board called Habitat for Humanity. And so these are not paid. In fact, you actually have to donate as a board member. So if you're going to donate to the organization anyways, then maybe it could be valuable for you to be on a board because you're privy to the financials and the governance of the organization. You get to see how the donations are spent and if the leadership is wisely spending the donation. So while it wasn't a paid board, it was very good for my personal development as a board member because something they did was they covered my membership in the Institute of Corporate Directors or ICD program. And then I also received a scholarship to do the ICD courses, which were pretty flexible to do while working as a staff physician. So being in the ICD program, that was helpful to better understand how to be an effective board member, how to ask the right questions and guide senior leadership when it comes to risks facing whatever the initiative the organization is proposing to do next. And it also gives you access to a portal for you to find paid and unpaid board opportunities where it'll actually post how much you would be paid if it is a paid board. And I also think being a board member has taught me a lot about leadership more than doing any leadership courses out there because you get to see multiple leadership styles in actions, the examples being from other board directors or the CEO themselves. So currently, I'm on a public sector board. So this is a paid role and it's kind of paid based on stipend. So for example, if you go to this committee meeting, you get like $150 or something like that, right? Or 100, I don't even know. It's after tax because it does get taxed. But I quite enjoy it because I do like being involved in public policy that impacts the health of Torontonians. So, you know how I mentioned this is also something for me to do in retirement? Because I know a lot of doctors in retirement, they don't feel like they have anything to do. So they go back into practice. But for me, I think I would like to join more boards as I am winding down my practice, because right now reading board materials can take up a lot of time. You don't get paid for that. But for those of you who might be wondering, okay, how much would, let's say, a corporate or private board member is paid? It can vary based on the industry, but how your listeners can kind of find out, because there's so many variation, is if you go on Cedar and you look up this document. It's called Management Proxy Circular, and you can actually see how, and the structure in which how some board directors are getting paid. So sometimes I look up these documents when I'm doing research for an investment, and then you can see some board members in some corporations getting paid like 100,000 to 300,000. Sometimes they also get like stocks, equities in the company as well. So hopefully that kind of clarifies things. I know it was a little bit roundabout, but
Yeah, no. That is great. Honestly, this is a newer concept for me. But for somebody
yeah.
like yourself, Steph, who I see as having multiple interests, both within and outside of medicine, this could be a great avenue, And I think it's just, like you say, these things take time as you build your network, as you learn about other things. And then you kind of just find something that really resonates with your beliefs, your values, something where you want, an area where you would like to have an impact. I think that's how I would try to approach it. Not that I sit on any boards, but I think it's wonderful what you're doing and what you're learning about. Guys, I hope you enjoyed that. There's a lot of information to cover, and to make it more digestible, I have broken it down into 2 episodes. The next episode will come out either 1 week or 2 weeks from today. Have to keep you guys on your toes. If you like what you're hearing, guys, I would be so grateful if you're able to leave a rating or review either on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And Steph's handles, Breaking Bad Debt, are in the show notes for both YouTube and for Instagram. BeyondMDPodcast@gmail.com is where you can reach me, and we will see you very soon. Stay well, stay savvy.